So you're a storyteller. It shows up in your academic and creative work, your purpose through academia and digital storytelling is to make visible the stories of people whose identities have been denied a spotlight. You shared about the 2016 election, the 2022 midterm election. In terms of how those things influenced how you show up today, you talked about focusing on power and cultural power as that relates to visibility. What are some of the ways that you do that in your work now? How does that show up for you? Just the various ways where that focus shows up in your practices and the ways that you work as an academic, as a storyteller.
Mhm. They're starting to bleed together now.
Ooh,
And
okay.
we're in the nascent stages of it. But for example, I started teaching a class in the spring, University of the District of Columbia, which is where I work. We have a general education kind of program. All the students have to take a class called Discovery Diversity. And professors have autonomy in how they teach that course. I decided that I wanted to use the Discovery Diversity course to focus on LGBTQ visibility in media and what that means in terms of just being able to see this group living, be they fictional stories or documentaries and like whatever it is that was happening at that time. What difference does that make ultimately to have a better sense of this group of people, what their experiences were, and how it relates to whatever is happening now? What was interesting about that is when I pitched the class, they were fine with it. Everything was cool. But then when I got ready to teach it, there was some pushback. I had pushback from a few students. In fact, one of them hit me up and was like, I like the way you teach, but can you just change the focus? There's many ways to think about diversity. So you don't have to just talk about like LGBTQ diversity. And I remember thinking like, if there are many ways to talk about diversity, then why can't I talk about it this way? Why can't you see your own diversity through this lens?
Hmm.
And the pushback that I got was to me that like I needed to teach it. We needed to be able to have this class because like folks can see themselves through other marginalized identities, but when it comes to queerness, they're like, nah, that part is not me.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm intentional about how I teach that class too. Like LGBTQ history and visibility is mostly the work of white people and white gay men. If you went just out in the world and asked folks to give you a sense of the history of visibility of queerness, they would by and large, unless they're like a black or brown person, they're probably going to tell you about Stonewall and about whatever white people experienced. And it's just so much more story here. You also don't get a lot of perspectives from like lesbians or queer women. And so even as I taught this class, that's about a marginalized group, I took it even further and I don't focus on queerness in the context of whiteness. It is black and brown and it is primarily women. It became a fascinating experience. Like by the time we got to the end of the semester, first of all, I don't teach it for the purpose of like people coming out. That's never my goal. But people need that space to understand that it is okay if that is a part of your identity or if you were
Hmm.
arrested and you want to ask some questions or you want to like play it out. People need that space to feel okay, to feel safe, to explore. And more people than we know or think are curious about the exploration.
Hmm.
That's the part that's not political. It's not about signing legislation. It's not about who has what rights. The ways that people naturally are is curious about queerness sometimes. And they don't
Hmm.
really have a space to be able to talk about that. And because I've created this class and because this is a topic that I'm comfortable with and I enjoy talking about it and I'm never talking about it from a perspective of you have to accept like gayness or it has to be like the top of mind for you. You have to consider it in all the things that you're doing. I never talk about it from that perspective. There's no like mandate on how you think about it, except that you got to consider it because this is what people's lived realities are. That is enough to just create that space of safety for folks to be able to explore. And it was a wonderful experience to have that. Where the group that I find to be like the least receptive or that I'm expecting to be the least receptive is usually like straight black men and older black women. And
Hmm.
both of those groups came around, both of them. By the time we
Mhm.
got to the end of the semester, it was like, I didn't know that. And now that I know that, doesn't mean that it's gonna like fully change everything. I might still have some questions. I might still have some discomfort, but I'm in a place now where I can be curious, where I can be open without being judgmental, where I can share what I've experienced and what I know now with other people and engage in the conversation to ask a question about, okay, why do you use these pronouns? So you're transitioning? What's that about? Like, how did that happen? As opposed to, I don't want to talk about it. I take that as progress. And that kind of stuff doesn't
Mhm.
happen unless somebody has the guts to say, no, we're talking about this. I'm going to
That's right.
show it. You're going to see it. You're going to watch. There's a wonderful documentary series from Apple TV. It's called Visible out on television. It's wonderful. I use it at the beginning of the class. But the thing that I point out to my students is we watch like 2 episodes. You have to get maybe like an episode and a half before you get to a queer person of color. That's what I mean. You know what I mean? You've been
Mhm.
reading or learning about like queerness, but it took you an hour and a half before they present you someone who looks like y'all in this classroom. What does that tell you? That the history of queerness doesn't start in like 1969 and it doesn't start with white people, but doesn't. But if
That's
this is
right.
the history that's missing something, and that sparks people's curiosities. First of all, I didn't know it was this old. And secondly, why aren't we here? And so
Mm.
then people become aware of the power of storytelling and the power of visibility in terms of how you begin to know what you begin to know about what life experience is. If you never saw it, then you don't know. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. Just means that nobody made it for you. Nobody showed it to you. So
Nobody nobody made it for you, nobody showed it to you. As I'm listening to you
mhm,
share the story, I'm thinking of a couple things. One, when you first talked about the pushback, I was thinking I was reminded of that new but old messaging around, "I agree with what you're doing, but I don't agree with the methods by which you're
mhm,
doing it." You know what I mean? So can we do it in a
mhm,
way that doesn't make me feel uncomfortable? So I thought about that, the kind of
mhm.
pushback and then how that can happen individually, but then also institutionally in some ways. And I also thought about I was reminded of when you were talking too about our socialization and the ways that we're
Mhm.
taught and the way storytelling and the power of thinking about. I'm really appreciating everything you're sharing around visibility and the importance of it and just the power of thinking about who gets to tell the stories that we hear often and
Yeah.
how that influences our ability to recognize that other stories are possible, that more stories are
Mhm.
possible than what we've been given. So I think about how education can be liberatory and in a way, and I'm listening to you describe it like, okay, I didn't necessarily and I'm paraphrasing, but it's okay. I didn't necessarily set the class up to be a space where folks would come out, but it also sounds like you created the psychological safety. You created the space for folks to be able to do that. And so on that end, I'm getting from the story the liberatory power of storytelling and education in the ways that it can, yeah, liberate folks from those messages of inferiority, and then also when you talked about the pushback from some of your students, some of the black men in the class, and then who was the other group? What's the other group you mentioned?
Older black women.
And older black women in the class.
Mhm.
First, like
Older straight black women. Mhm.
older straight black women. Yes, let's be clear
Mhm.
about that. So from the straight older black men in the class
Mhm.
and the older straight black women in the class, getting that initial resistance there, but then also over the course of that sustained communication together, the sustained learning, engaging with things that might push back against what they thought they knew, it's like over time here, wait a minute. And like you said, it's not necessarily there's still more work to be done. But in that course and in the storytelling and in your education, your teaching played a role in pushing back against, in some ways, those messages of superiority as well. I expect to be, when we talk about diversity, I expect to be, I'm a black man, I expect to be represented, right? And
Yeah. Mhm.
calm down with all this other stuff. And so that
Mhm.
messaging too, even though we might have some marginalized identities in other ways, it sounds like you sharing that story, it was also a way of pushing back against that narrative, is that
Yeah.
I deserve to be centered in ways that y'all do not. Even though we share some
Yes.
affinity, when we talk about centering and we talk about equity and diversity, oh, there's many ways to talk about diversity and inclusion. I want to be centered as the black
Mhm.
man, that kind of thing, and chipped away at that. So I
100%.
like how you said you counted that as success too, as growth too, being able to do that because I think it
Yeah.
is.
It 100%, like, you nailed it here, and that's why I really appreciated that you elevated that point in kind of the intake. How do people who exist within these margins also have privileges that show up. And that was a big part of it. We're talking about like folks like Sylvester James, who was king of disco, queen of disco. He's very gender fluid in the 70s and 80s. And getting straight Black men to understand that Sylvester might be a slightly more difficult example just because he was gender fluid and sort of gender queer. And he would play around in these spaces, very effeminate. But he would say, and there's an interview that he does with Joan Rivers, and she called him a drag queen. And she's not trying to be offensive in calling him a drag queen, but that's how she understood it at that time. And he's, girl, I'm not a drag queen. I'm me. I'm Sylvester. Having that, one of the other like important revelations of teaching this course is allowing folks to understand that how people identify themselves is also incredibly personal. So just because you think this looks like that and you want to paint over it as all the same, it's not. In the same way that as folks who share as cisgender folks as like you and I are, we
Yeah,
might look at someone and say, oh, like that person is probably non-binary or that person might be trans, whatever. But we don't know how they identify. You don't know until they tell you.
that's
And
right.
it's like being able to respect what somebody else's journey is, how they understand and see themselves, and not centering in, I see it as this. Don't nobody care how you see it. This person told you.
It's said in that same level of very matter of
Mhm,
factness, that same level
mhm,
of, "Oh, I'm just 100% sure about this because I think so, so it is." It's no,
mhm.
you're right.
That's a base level of respect and dignity that we all expect. And that's the privileging of certain parts of our identities that we would take that dignity away from another person because we don't believe they should have it. And if
Mm,
you tell me that your pronouns are she, they, I'm gonna call you she. Or you tell me that you whatever you tell me your pronouns are, I'm gonna call you whatever makes me most comfortable.
mhm.
Or you are a person who's living a trans experience and you tell me what your name is, and I'm gonna call you what I think your name should be. Like sitting with that, sit with the privilege that is inherent in that and really understand, why would you disrespect somebody in that way? If you told me your name was James and I continually call you Pete, you're gonna be mad at me at a certain
You're
point
gonna be mad.
because
You're
it
gonna be
doesn't matter
mad.
what I think it is. Call you. And I enjoy beginning to break that down to say, what is it about you? What is it about your superiority that just won't allow you to call a person what they told you to call them? You would do that to you. Why okay you're doing it to another person?
That's
So
right.
those conversations they're instructive. And I think it allows people to begin to see also that, damn, I might be being an asshole. That I might be like acting up here. But and beginning to question what's underneath that. What are you doing? What are you thinking? What do you think about this person who's a part of humanity just like you are? And we can start to interrogate that. So yeah, the other thing I'll say is I don't like to sugarcoat any of this. Discomfort is a part of it.
Part of it.
Discomfort is a part of growth. It is a part of learning. And so you're gonna be uncomfortable. If it's something you're unfamiliar with, you're gonna be uncomfortable. And that's once you engage, you're always gonna be uncomfortable until you get to know it a little bit, to peek behind the curtain to see what it is and see that it actually isn't so scary. This is another example of human existence and it's not really that scary. Now that I know it, it doesn't even affect you in any particular way except to respect another person's dignity and humanity. And so the fact that folks are afraid that they're going to be uncomfortable or any of that, they had to deal with it, except that you probably will be. But that's okay.
Yeah. Except that you probably will be, except that particularly when it comes to having some privilege in that, this is a space and time where you're feeling some discomfort. And you know what? But what I appreciate, we're talking about social justice origin stories, and you sharing the story about your class and some of the impacts that it has had and that your teaching has had on your students. In a way, I also feel like it has had an impact on their own social justice origin stories too. It's for
Mhm,
them. It's like, all right, so sometimes having classes like that, I know for me, both as a participant and then also as an instructor as well, sometimes students, depending on where we were in the class, sometimes as early as that first semester, after being exposed to right the importance of all the things you shared and challenging those dominant narratives, recognizing that there are larger stories outside of the ways that I've been centered. And now, in a way, they're starting
mhm,
to pay attention to some of that. And it can become harder
mhm,
sometimes to go
mhm.
back home to communities, to friend groups, to family, other things, and listen to some of the same things. And you've had this different experience, and now you're thinking differently. And it has a way of setting people on a path to learn more and do more. So I really appreciate you
Mhm.
sharing that story, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It's a positive ripple for sure.
it's a positive ripple, yeah, it's a positive ripple.
Mhm.